These are 5 of SpongeBob's most wretched episodes of all time. The 5th episode, Squirrel Jelly, is arguably the most tolerable of any of the ones we will be discussing. The episode starts with Sandy, SpongeBob, and Patrick playing basketball at Goo Lagoon. But Sandy is so competitive that she ends up ruining SpongeBob and Patrick's whole experience. So SpongeBob and Patrick decide to abandon Sandy to go and have fun jellyfishing in Jellyfish Fields without her. Still, she crashes the party anyway because she can't take a hint, apparently. Sandy ends up taking the jellyfishing way too far, capturing and holding them inside her suit, which is basically just suffocating the animals. She's so clueless that SpongeBob and Patrick have to remind her that jellyfishing is about releasing the animals, not just capturing them. But Sandy gets bored of that almost immediately and starts feeding the jellyfish Frankenstein fish food to make it more of a challenge for them. But the fish food must be some kind of steroids because these jellyfish get pumped up, like Schwarzenegger level pumped. So Sandy really gets into it, using her spacesuit to try to capture the jellyfish in an insane way. However, she ends up destroying Jellyfish Fields with her rocket boots. All of the jellyfish are gone and the field is burning down. But only now, when she's basically destroyed an entire habitat, does Sandy finally consider that maybe what she did was wrong. And you know what? We call that personal growth. I mean, she had to almost kill an entire species to figure it out, but still, unfortunately, she has no idea that the surviving jellyfish have amassed into one giant monster jellyfish. When we meet Sandy again, she completely changes her ways, embracing a new pacifist lifestyle, mainly consisting of meditation and hitting giant gongs. But her peaceful life is interrupted when SpongeBob and Patrick come banging at the door of her tree dome, fleeing the giant jelly monster. They beg Sandy to help them destroy the mega jellyfish and save Bikini Bottom, but she refuses to do anything about it because her new non-violent lifestyle prevents her from attacking, which is convenient since she, created the monster. Instead, she tries all these pacifist, peaceful ways to try and stop the big jellyfish, like hitting the giant gong. I mean, she's not even trying. Eventually, Sandy realizes that her pacifist ways are not enough to destroy the giant jellyfish monster she unintentionally created, so she decides to unleash her brutal squirrel foo, beating up the giant monster from the inside and causing it to explode, spewing thousands of regular jellyfish and saving Bikini Bottom, finally. The episode ends with SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy jellyfishing peacefully, and Sandy is actually playing fair. But then one of the jellyfish stings her and, well, it doesn't end well. Basically, nobody really learns anything in the episode. The jellyfish fight back after their habitat is destroyed, but they're the bad guys, and Sandy is the good guy because she chooses violence. It's such a weird approach for the show, but we're not even into the worst, most wretched episode yet. Crashing in at number 4 is The Splinter, one of the grossest episodes of SpongeBob that doesn't include crabs or Squidward half naked. This episode starts with SpongeBob in his usual happy place, flipping burgers at the Krusty Krab. But he gets so excited about getting to make 2 Krabby Patties that he accidentally flings his spatula up into the ceiling. So SpongeBob stacks a bunch of boxes and climbs up to get to the roof to get it, but he accidentally drops a bunch of scissors and swords right under him, which I don't even want to know why a burger restaurant has swords. I mean, I know Mr. Krabs hates customers, but anyway, SpongeBob falls and he just manages to miss the blades thanks to his spatula, which is good, but also, I mean, he's a sponge, so was there really any danger there? But even though SpongeBob misses certain death, he slips on some tartar sauce and slides across the floor, jamming his thumb into a broken piece of wood and leaving him with a brutal splinter that causes his thumb to swell. And here we get into some really genuinely disgusting stuff, so if I had to see it, you do too. Sorry, man. Because no matter what he tries, SpongeBob just cannot get the splinter out, and the hungry customer who ordered 2 burgers is still without one, and he's impatient. But SpongeBob can't actually hold the spatula, so he has to tie it to his nose like some kind of burger dolphin. Unfortunately, he's caught by Squidward. After he sees SpongeBob's splinter, Squidward decides to take advantage of the situation, tricking SpongeBob into thinking that Mr. Krabs will send him home if he finds out, which is cruel, but also SpongeBob would 100% prank Squidward in the same way. So, SpongeBob begs Squidward to keep it to himself and calls in Patrick, his doctor, to treat him. But maybe you don't know this, Patrick is an idiot, and he comes in dressed up saying, "You called the right person, Mr. SpongeBob, which is so untrue. Patrick basically forces the splinter further in, creating a genuinely terrifying-looking injury. And then, to make matters even worse, he pours garbage on to soothe the swelling, which just infects it more. And then, he abandons SpongeBob because his shift is over and says, "Call me in the morning if you can still dial the phone." Such a great friend. So, SpongeBob tries to hide the thumb from Krabs and Squidward because it's so gross, but they see it and Squidward passes out because, well, why wouldn't you? But Krabs just picks the splinter right out with his pinchers, which is awesome, but it still looks like it's about to burst. Luckily, it bursts with confetti, which is so typically SpongeBob. But then it erupts with pus, which is less joyful. But once all the grossness is expelled, his thumb goes back to normal, allowing him to get back to all his usual, less gross adventures. As much as I love SpongeBob, this episode was just a mistake. The show has never gotten this gross and weird outside of this episode, which really says it all. And while we could argue it's a horror-themed episode, there just isn't enough horror to justify it. It's just gross. Demolition Doofus crashes into number 3, just like SpongeBob when he's inexplicably put behind the wheel of a boat. This episode starts with SpongeBob making another attempt to get his boating license, but as always, he keeps crashing into the same 2 cars, inflating Mrs. Puff every single time. In fact, he inflates Mrs. Puff so much that she ends up sending the car flying, and SpongeBob steers them right into the school's lighthouse, crippling Mrs. Puff for life. Yeah, that's where the episode starts. This one is dark, man. When they get to the hospital, the doctor tells them that Mrs. Puff will never be able to puff again. And SpongeBob's first reaction is to say, "From now on, I guess we'll have to call you Mrs. Pop." Yeah, he just laughs. Read the room, man. Mrs. Puff gets so angry that she starts strangling his nose. And I mean, can you blame her? This sponge just crippled her and is making jokes about it. But the doctor tranquilizes her to save his life. And then SpongeBob too, because, well, he's SpongeBob. Sometime later, SpongeBob visits Mrs. Puff to bring her flowers, which she seems to be allergic to. Still unable to recognize that he has literally crippled this woman, he forces her into a wheelchair and pushes her into a hallway where the doctors are holding a demolition derby with muscular men. Just, for the fun of it. But Mrs. Puff sees this and imagines SpongeBob during the game. Let me just say that again. Mrs. Puff fantasizes about SpongeBob being killed as part of a demolition derby. And she's so in love with the idea that she tells him he will get extra credit if he goes through with it. Yikes. Mrs. Puff shows the derby manager how much damage SpongeBob causes in a boat, securing him a place in the derby. They even put a sock on his head and call him Le Squish, which is a little moment of lightness in what might be the darkest episode in the history of the show. But when he actually gets into the derby, SpongeBob has no idea he's supposed to take the other racers out, which means he's an easy target for everyone else. The only problem is that he's so incompetent that nobody can get him. In fact, he accidentally takes everybody else out by pure luck, and it infuriates Mrs. Puff even more because she's just full psycho at this point. So she takes matters into her own hands, eventually getting into a monster truck and chasing him down to try and literally kill him. Let's not forget that part. But SpongeBob keeps dodging her until eventually they collide into the boating school, bringing Mrs. Puff's Puff back and bringing the tower down, crushing and presumably killing them. So yeah, that's fun. This might be the darkest episode of the entire show, and it feels pretty horrible, honestly. SpongeBob is so cruel and inconsiderate, and Mrs. Puff is straight up psychotic. It really doesn't fit with the tone of the show or these characters, and it's just more mean-spirited than any other episode. Not great, but here's a worse one. Number 2 is SpongeBob, You're Fired, an episode that encapsulates all the joys of capitalism into one depressing, soul-sucking watch. This episode opens with SpongeBob's happy working day destroyed by Mr. Krabs' news that he's fired with immediate effect. It turns out that Krabs has found that if he fires SpongeBob, he can save a nickel. This suggests that's his entire salary, and if he bought or rented that 3-floor pineapple for a nickel? Whoa. The news devastates SpongeBob, who cries so hard that he floods the Krusty Krab with his tears. Squidward has to basically force him out the door just to get him to accept that he is no longer working there, and what's really messed up here is that Squidward is really happy about the whole thing. He actually goes to the effort of congratulating Mr. Krabs about it. That's cold. But then Squidward does have to ask his boss who's going to cook the patties now. Don't worry, Mr. Krabs has thought about that, and the cheapest way to do it is to do it himself. After all, he was a golden spatula fry cook in the Navy, but as soon as he grabs the spatula, it just instantly burns, so maybe that's why it was golden. It was on fire. At home, SpongeBob is not doing well because he can't flip burgers, but Patrick urges him to see it as the greatest gig in the world and takes it upon himself to teach SpongeBob the art of fun employment. Basically, Patrick's whole unemployed life is just forcing Squidward to have breakfast with him, taking a mid-morning nap, and forcing himself on other people to enjoy their food without actually having to pay for it. To be fair, that kinda sounds like a dream life. But Sandy doesn't agree, and she tells SpongeBob that he needs to get a job and not be a freeloader like his best buddy. So he goes out to find a job in the only world he wants to be a part of, minimum wage fast food. It's a different kind of dream life, I guess. SpongeBob cycles through a bunch of different restaurants, the Weenie Hut, Pizza Pie Hole, Taco Sombrero, and Wet Noodle, but he's fired from all of them because he keeps molding the food into patties and cooking them like that. He's incapable of doing anything else. It's actually kind of worrying. But the amount of firings leads him to a major crisis. He thinks he sucks, but then his door knocks and he's kidnapped by a hot dog. Yeah, just go with it. It turns out that Mr. Wiener actually now loves the idea of a wiener patty. But then he's freed by the pineapple guy and kidnapped by them because they also love the idea of a pizza patty. Suddenly he's just being fought over by all these fast food mascots who really want his patty brain. Ultimately, SpongeBob is dragged out by Killer Krabby Patty and brought back to Krabby Patty, which basically hemorrhages customers thanks to Mr. Krabs' sucky cooking. It turns out that Killer Krabby Patty is actually Squidward, which is kinda sweet. He admits he hates SpongeBob, but I hate the smell of burning Krabby Patties even more. SpongeBob is rehired on the spot and immediately gets back to his poorly paid grunt work, and Krabs gets that nickel, by the way. He installs a pay toilet. Kinda genius. Okay, so there are really two issues here. Number one, so much of this episode is filler. I mean, do we need 2 minutes of SpongeBob crying? Do we need him to go to 4 different restaurants for the same joke? Does it have to be a 2-part episode? Like, nah, man. But also, it's so cruel. Like, it's never a good sign when SpongeBob loses his job. The episode is just gonna be a bummer. And to do it for the sake of a nickel makes Krabs look even worse than he usually does. It's just not a good time to watch, honestly. And now to what you've all been waiting for. Our number one most wretched episode in the history of this show sees Patrick being given some responsibility. What kind of idiot would allow him to be Pet Sitter Pat? This episode starts with SpongeBob getting an invitation to Grandma SquarePants' birthday party, but he can't go until he has someone to look after Gary. Finally, a relatable episode. Yeah, well, not for long. SpongeBob asks Squidward first, but he refuses. Gary has been eating his kelp garden, and apparently Squidward is excellent at holding grudges, which means SpongeBob has to turn to Patrick, which is honestly the worst idea imaginable. It'd probably be better just to let Gary stay home alone. Anyway, SpongeBob gives Patrick a list of things to do involving Gary, and he agrees to go along with it. But as soon as SpongeBob is gone, Patrick just throws it away because he can't read it. It's upside down. I mean, seriously, SpongeBob, think this through a little bit, man. Patrick eventually decides to take care of his little buddy and feed him, but just to make sure that it's okay for Gary to eat, Patrick chows it all down himself and shares absolutely none of it. And somehow SpongeBob kinda knows, probably because he's besties with Patrick and he knows Patrick is an idiot. But he's having these visions of Patrick doing awful things with Gary, and it makes him seriously anxious. So SpongeBob starts calling over and over to check up on things, and his visions are right, of course. Gary's in a constant state of mortal danger, but SpongeBob thinks they're having fun and decides not to bother questioning anything. And then we see what may be the worst thing of this entire episode, and it's actually a double disaster. So Patrick tries to give Gary a bath, but Gary really does not want to go through with it, so Patrick decides to do the opposite, which is apparently to get a flamethrower and burn Gary alive. Bro, what the heck? Anyway, SpongeBob calls again when Patrick and Gary are having a legitimately good time, and they're having a good time because Patrick has flooded the house. So I guess that's kinda good, but SpongeBob again can't read the room and becomes convinced they're in danger. He runs all the way from his grandma's party to get to his house, only to find his house totally destroyed and full of water. And he rushes upstairs to find Gary reading a book to Patrick, who doesn't even understand a word of it. It's a happy ending, I guess. I mean, this episode is horrible. Patrick is basically abusing Gary the whole time. He doesn't feed him, he burns him alive, and even floods SpongeBob's house to boot. I mean, Patrick has always been an idiot, but this is just straight up unpleasant to watch. So, these are the 5 most wretched episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants. What do you think? Are there worse episodes? Do you disagree on any? Feel free to let me know.